Welcome back and welcome to lesson 3 of the Houdini Environment Beginner Series. This lesson is going to continue and we're going to cover a general overview of the file itself, a basic introduction to our workflow, and then also I will help get you set up on how to actually get the file working. So if you've gone ahead and tried to actually open up our stage, so if I give it a second, and select down here at the end of our graph, you see all these errors, and that's because none of this geometry has been cached. So I did not include those in the project files because it would be kind of a waste of space, and also now I can show you how to actually save those to disk. Also, this is our full scene, and if this is new to you, then definitely check out that intro series where we kind of introduce everything from scratch. But we will go through everything, so do not be worried or discouraged if you are having trouble. So follow along and give it the effort because it's definitely worth it. So our general workflow for this series and for this environment is going to be creating our objects in the creating our objects in the geometry context, which would be these subnets here, this geometry nets here, or SOP nets, and then importing that into stage. And then within stage, we'll set up the layout, we'll set up cameras and lights, and then we will import back into the geometry context. So I guess not technically the object context, but we will import back into geometry context to do other operations on the data and processing, and maybe create new points for scattering, and then back to stage. So we're going back and forth between the two, and we'll start in the geometry context. Give it a second, I'm jumping back into here. We'll work here in the stage context. In these cases here, we're actually going back into the geometry context. And then we will have everything else in the stage context. So we'll see how this all fits together. Why I chose to do it this way will hopefully become relevant by the end of the series. And then you'll have an understanding of where you could do the work and where you could change the workflow. So it's ultimately up to you on whether you'd want to do layout in stage or in geometry context, but I chose to do a partial layout in geometry context and then the rest in stage. So again, our geometry context is for the modeling, stage is for the layout, the lighting, the cameras, and the rendering, and then I had a quick rough definition of layout here. So the key goals within this whole series are to maintain a level of control for the important parts of the scene. So maybe where the big buildings go, where the big buildings go and where the main hero assets are. And then for the rest of the stuff, so like the grass or the rocks, the things that aren't quite as important, we can leverage Houdini's proceduralism to create effective and efficient networks that can tackle those tasks without us having to do much work. But again, that goes back to what we just talked about in the last video, which was our art-directed proceduralism. So finding a blend between proceduralism and manual destructive workflows that lets us get enough control, but not too much control. So to cache our files, we're going to jump inside these when this is the first geometry container, and we're just going to go file cache, and we're just going to click save to disk. And we'll cover the modeling here later. If you want to jump ahead and read some of the slides, I do welcome you to do that. Whoops. I accidentally closed these here. We're just going to go through all of these and then save them to disk. And you'll actually notice the orientation of objects is in the positive Z. And that's because when Houdini does instancing, which we'll actually cover if I hit U to go up, we'll cover a little theory example here in lesson 16. I'm going to continue going through each geometry container and then caching the individual setups. So one thing you'll also notice here is these time shifts. And the reason for those is I chose to do a seed for the randomization across all objects as a frame. So for frame 5, I'll randomize the box to make it 2 units long, 2 meters long. And for frame 7, I have a random function, which we'll also cover later, that makes it 3 or 2.5 or 5. So every frame number here, they're being referenced in a few of these other nodes, and those are what decide the size of box, the placement of these scattered, which ones are cut up and divided, which ones are not. So that is an easy way to do it. And then the time shift here is to freeze and stick to a single one of those. So I'm going to save all of these and then actually show you one more node. You might have an error for one of these nodes up here. Save to disk. All right, looks like that's not saving, so we'll figure out why. There we go. Looks like you might have to click it a few times. And we have all of those here. But you might have an error on a missing node or this node here, which is a side effects labs node. And I've actually used it because it's super helpful. And also I do recommend you get side effects labs. So I won't cover that in one of the videos because I think it's pretty well documented by Side Effects, which is the developer of Houdini and Side Effects Labs. So definitely look into that. You might need to install it. I don't know actually if it would come as an error or still work without this, but look that up. And then if there's questions, leave one in the comments below and I can put a link to the documentation for installing that. So you to go up. And I'm going to continue going through and caching our later setups. And then you'll see again, I have the randomization for this network set up in a few places. But as I time shift through this, you can see it changes and it randomizes a few different settings. And we'll learn about how to have full control over this. So if we wanted to have 25 spokes instead of these tiny towers, if we want to have 2 of them or 3 or 5, those are all things that we can set up intentionally and then let Houdini randomize some of the things that we care less about. Like, is it 1 meter tall or 1.5 meters tall? We kind of want Houdini to make those decisions for us and then not have to manually do all of those. And again, I'm going through file cache by file cache and clicking save to disk. There we go. And we'll also learn about these little wires procedurally, but that is done actually with no simulation. So that's this little loop here, and we'll learn about kind of how to do that. And these are little outlines of what the modeling process looks like. So you to go up, and we'll jump inside Podium. And this one I actually have not cached, which is maybe not the best thing to do, but I liked to have it flexible so I could update it live in stage. So maybe I'll actually show you that later. But I could change here on circle the size of our circle. And you see it automatically, it procedurally defines the size of these blocks here. So space G will frame me in the middle. If it's a very small circle, I'll only have a few bricks. But if it's a very big circle, I'll have a lot of bricks. And that's the really cool thing about Houdini. And actually, you can now see the division size on this circle. If I hit W for wireframe, you can see the resolution is actually being reflected in our instancing. So if I go down to edge rocks, and I'm getting sidetracked here, but if I set this to 12, you can see these edges here. So we'll cover this all later. I'm going to put it at 128 actually now, and then put this back to a size of 1. You to go up, and then we'll jump into house geometry prep, which is the bigger of the networks. I think maybe the biggest in this file. And I'll show you really quickly on this merge here. And again, we'll cover all of this. I have this template flag, looks like at the bottom, which is what that was. I'm not sure if you'll have that or not, but you don't need that yet. So going back up, if I click play, you can see each frame again randomizes a different part of the house. And there's a few rules defined above which set, should the wall be a window? Should the wall be a garage? Should the wall be a door? Or should it be empty? And actually, one funny thing, this empty wall is a modeling challenge we'll actually partially do together in lesson 12. And then also I'll give you some ideas on how you can actually use this as a exercise to practice some more modeling in the context of a scene that's already been prepared. And then also one more note, these are a little farther away and the space between nodes might be bigger than you'd want. I organize these so they're easy to see, but we will have to pan and move a lot between these nodes. So if it is just you can put them way closer together, but this was the best way I found to organize it so it's easy to go through in multiple lessons and easy to split what section is what. And while we're talking about splitting, these are maps of the network and each lesson has a box. So if you want to come back later and say, okay, well, where in the file was the ridge and the dome added for the roof? You can see, okay, here, and that is this section here. And then if you do need to move these, you can move them around, get them out of order, and they are also included in the files. So to continue, we're going to cache the houses. And then also the layout for the houses I've chosen to do in the geometry context. So I chose to do it right here actually with these transforms. And the reason for that is I wanted to bake, and by bake I mean I want to create a point attribute and save it to the object. So it looks like this third house didn't get cached. Should pop in maybe. There we go. But I wanted to take this ground, which will fetch from a different podium, the other object. And if you remember, our file paths here are defining the location of each node, and this we did cover in the intro series. So I am going to skip over kind of this basic Houdini stuff because now we're in the more applied and the funner, not funner, it's not a word, but the more interesting areas of Houdini. But this is the attribute I needed, which is a shade height. And you can see I'm using a color to remap this. But what I use this for is I actually use this in shading to set the height from our ground. So then this is used to add a little dark ridge of buildup and dirt next to the ground. And then if the ground actually changes, which I just did a transform, and I'm going to move the ground. So I'm going to select the transform node, hover over my viewport, and hit return to get a handle. And now you can see as the ground changes, this edge, this mask, this attribute that I've created and baked, and by baking I mean storing, it's saved to the objects, and you can actually see it if I type. It is called shade height. And what we can do is we can either type in shade height and we'll see it here, or we can use our wildcards and say anything that has the word shade in it. And it looks like we have two actually. But you'll see as we select this transform and move it. Okay, well, we can't see that because we're not selecting that node. But essentially this value is stored and it's written on our individual points. And each point, it's a lot of points here, but I'll show you just in case you're new. Each point has a point number, and then each point number has a location in this geometry spreadsheet. So right here, this is point number 233,004, and it has a shade height and shade mask attribute of these values. So that is the information that's stored on the geometry in our spreadsheet. So there is our house, our setup. I'm going to hit U to go up. And now we've cached all the, in cache I mean save to disk. So we've saved these files to disk. So now when we open them up, Houdini doesn't have to recompute or recook everything above here. Because Houdini working through these nodes is called cooking. And we are also cooking. Now into the stage layout, I'm going to double click that to go inside it. And we'll give it a second. And then this is very familiar to what we've done in the previous lessons. So I encourage you to go through and review those. But we get all our props, we merge them, we hand placed a few. We actually did this in the fire tutorial. We hand placed a few logs. We actually imported those logs back, I think, to simulate in Axiom, which was a cool little setup. And we're going to do something similar here, where we're going to import and instance rocks, which looks like they should be here, but potentially not rendering. So I'll show you, I'll just see what happens when they render, because that might be a viewport bug, or if that is a scene file issue, I will work through live now to fix it, because if I have it, then you most likely do as well. And while we're waiting, I'm going to turn on correction toolbar and aces. And it looks like our rocks are not showing up. So that is the reason why. Let's see what's going on. Oh, okay. Actually, that's a great example. Turns out there's cache nodes inside the instancing that I forgot about. So that's one quick thing. As we go through this, there's a lot of work that went into preparing this file. So I don't necessarily remember how everything exactly was set up, because it's been a few weeks of work setting this up. But I'll save this data here, and you'll see we'll cover this later, but this is how I'm setting up the instancing. And you can see this is an example of the size and then the orientation that our rocks will have. And then I did another visualization here for the size. So this will all be covered later, but that's a good example that I might make mistakes as I'm walking through this file, and I'm going to leave them in because I think that's going to be helpful to see that I have to work through things as well, and there's issues that come up and I will debug them, because I think a big important thing with learning is seeing how you approach new challenges and then really how actually the problems are solved that do come up. So again, I'm going through these nodes. I'm locating the file cache nodes. And I'm going to rearrange this just a tiny bit so it's not a zigzag like that. But I'm going through, finding the file cache nodes, saving them, and then we'll actually create some new geometry to instance and set up a few variations here. This we'll also cover later. You can instance lights in Solaris. So I could take a light, a point light, copy it onto points, in which case I brought in the towers and I placed lights on the top of the towers. And we'll do a cool challenge where I think I'm going to do wiring between some challenges. If you look down here at lesson 20, there's a bunch of ideas for us to extend the scene. And then some of these I'll do with you live, and then some of these I'll leave to you as a challenge to do by yourself, and then some I might show my solutions to in a bonus video. So again, there's really no correct way to work. There's some ways you should work, but you usually have the flexibility to decide how you want to approach a problem, which is the best thing about Houdini. All right, now down to end of graph, which right here is this null I set up. I'm going to grab this camera. I'm going to disable the view of my cameras here again, and the lights here. I'm going to save. And then these all, again, we've covered before, but as we work through these, you'll see how they're set up and how they work. And then let's hope our scene renders correctly. We'll give it a second, and it might take longer on your computer. I do have 3 GPUs, so usually the rendering is pretty quick. All right, here we go. Looks good. It looks actually like the grass does not have, and I'm right clicking here, by the way, to zoom. So right click and drag. It looks like the grass does not have a material assigned. So I'm going to do that now live because these files are the lesson files that I'm actually working with. So let's pause and then I'll show you why that's not assigned. So we import our grass in the scattering area here, and we are saving assets, environment, grass, and we are saving that to assets, environment, and grass. And that's this right here. Later down the line, we have our materials, and we want to assign environment materials, and this should all be familiar. And I've chosen to assign environments, props, house, and tower in separate nodes. So that way, if I want to disable and then create maybe a variation where different parts of the object have a different material, it's as simple as that. And then I just change these names here. So I'm going to delete that and put it back to how it was. I want to assign the grass, and we'll figure out why. There we go. All right, this looks intentional because it's a good exercise to teach, but this actually was an accident that I did. So if you look here in our scene graph path, our grass is stored under assets, environment, grass. The primitive we're trying to use as grass is looking in environment/grass. That primitive does not exist. So we can see there's no environment grass primitive. It's under assets, environment, grass. So I need to add this assets prefix, which now it will recognize that grass. I'm going to click anywhere above here. This little slash will get rid of this selection, or it looks like the favorites might get rid of that. Now it's selecting assets, environment, grass. So I can type that in, or I could actually drag and drop. And the reason for this is actually because it was organized originally under just environment. And then as I progressed through the lesson, I rearranged the scene, and it looks like I forgot to change that. So going down here, and the reason again, this was selected up here, the materials get assigned down here, so I need my display flag below the assignment materials. So right now I'll see the material on my environment and the grass, but not on the props, not on the house, and not on the towers, because those are below the current display flag. So this will all be blank, and our grass should actually be fixed. And we'll see. And it'll take a little bit of time, and you see, there we go, to get used to how this works. But once you understand the order, also one more thing actually, the camera right now is a very long focal length because the camera I was looking through, this one, had a focal length of 185, and now my viewport by default has that same focal length. I can reset it by refreshing or reframing to home. So if I click on this viewport and then hit space G, whoops, and zoom in, it'll reset the focal length of my viewport camera to the default. Again, space G, and it looks like it thinks there's something really big in the scene. But usually it'll frame on what we have, and there must be something very big. Actually, there is. This is getting sidetracked, but I really want you to understand Houdini. So right now, it's probably this camera, this outlier camera, that is setting the bound to frame everything. So now it needs to show this camera in the view. So if I hit space G, everything will be framed. And now, if I'm thinking correctly, if I select above one of these materials, none of these cameras exist according to this node here. And we have this selected and displayed. So if I now hit space G over the viewport here with this node selected, there we go. And it brings me closer. So usually things work the way they should, and sometimes there might be a mistake or you might be thinking of it differently, but it'll all make sense later. And then just to show you again, all our materials are now assigned. And they actually look pretty good. I'll let it refresh here. And if you really want to dive into materials, the beginner lesson 2, we cover pretty much everything from scratch on setting materials up, And we're actually going to jump off from where we left off in that lesson to create the materials for this one. And there we go. And these are the renders and the cameras. And if you remember from the fire lesson, we did break up a little bit about the different cameras. Whoops, I'm going to jump into one of these, do a quick render, and then check the lesson plan to make sure nothing is being missed. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So we're covering a lot of stuff. Everything really is important. And then I do want to give you a really holistic approach to environments so you can create your own. Because that's the goal of trying to learn Houdini. Not just recreating tutorials, but you want to be able to make your own shots and scenes without having to follow along. All right, so that's going to be the end of lesson 3. We'll jump straight into lesson 4 next, which is going to be the start of modeling, and then we'll slowly work up how everything was put together and then get more complex with the modeling as we go. So awesome. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.